Welcome to the Becoming Body Smart podcast, where we unlock the secrets of sustainable health and fitness and help you master your health habits. If you're tired of quick fixes, generic blueprints, and chasing short-term results, you're in the right place. It's time to become Body Smart.
Welcome, everybody. It's a Monday morning, bright and early after a very snowy Sunday. That was pretty awesome, although my drive, I worked at the hospital. I covered a shift at the hospital yesterday morning, and whoa, the drive-in was wild. 89 was like a complete mess, and if I hadn't been in our Suburban, I probably would not have made it. There were several cars not reaching their destination that morning. Anyway, wonderful to have you all here. Yeah, excited for the new year. I know we've had a few calls. This isn't the first one of the new year, but yeah, excited to be here talking about a topic that we've hit several other aspects kind of similar to it, but this is a new twist, I guess, on this idea. So misleading mindsets. If we've kind of posted that outline of it up above. And so, yeah, Marc, send that again just so it's more recent in the chat.
Deal.
But so, yeah, misleading mindsets is what we wanted to talk about this morning. Because I think a lot of the time, as we're getting into our New Year's resolutions, as we're getting into kind of what's important to us and everything, we find that a lot of our mindsets behind pursuing goals just are kind of wrong, kind of backwards, and aren't leading us toward success, aren't leading us toward happy, healthy thoughts. And so we want to talk today a little bit more about what are the mindsets that are going to lead us toward success. What's going to help us be able to not get in our own way from being successful. So these misleading mindsets. So the first one is we often think about things in absolutes. Kind of these all or nothing about ourselves, instead of that we're all kind of on a spectrum or a gradient of maybe some of our character traits. We tend to totally maybe over-own some of those things. And so, Marc, tell us more about some of the absolutes that we tend to believe. You're still muted.
I tell you what, today, I don't know, not my day. So yeah, like Cameron said, I always do this, or I never do this, or I can't do this, or just anything around those angles. And the problem with that is it goes back to what we've talked about before, of that idea that our minds are kind of goal oriented, right? Whatever we're feeding them is what they're going to look for evidence for. It's what they're going to pay attention to. And so what happens is when we over-identify with certain character traits, right? I'm just this way. We tend to pay more attention to evidences where we do show up that way, and we ignore evidences when we didn't show up that way, when we did something different. And even if the times that we showed up different than that far outweigh the times that we did, that's not what we pay attention to. And so we kind of reinforce that this is my identity, this is who I am, and I'm unable to break out of that, right? I'm unable to be a different way. Even if there's tons of evidence to the contrary, we don't notice that. And so it can get us stuck, right? It can get us from trying new things or from moving forward because we just believe this about ourselves, and I'm just this way. And so when we can kind of distance ourselves from that and say, you know what, yeah, I do this. Sometimes I do it a lot, right? Or you know what, when I'm really stressed, when I'm feeling really stressed, I tend to make decisions like this. Or when I'm in this situation, I tend to act like that. And so being able to kind of step back and put ourselves in the observer's chair and recognize when we tend to get into absolute mindsets can help us to wean ourselves off of those, because again, it becomes a pattern kind of rut in our brain. And so that can again end up limiting us. And so if we just can step back, identify that, and recognize when it shows up, then we can start to kind of put in fail safes for when we get into that situation or when we start feeling a certain way.
Yeah. So I think those absolute mindsets really do get in our way because they make us feel like we can't change, that that's just who I am. And so I think one of the things we have to understand is just because that's what I'm doing right now, it doesn't mean that's who I am, and that that's a changeable thing. It's all just about habits and patterns. And so that's maybe a habit I have, but that doesn't mean I can't change that habit or change that pattern in my life. Um, and so I think we get too stuck often on believing that because that's what I often do, or that's my innate reaction, that that's who I am, versus like, oh, that's just a pattern that I have right now, that I can change. I just have to make that a conscious effort to modify that. We I think one of those absolutes is feeling like because that's what I tend to do, or that's my initial reaction, that that's who I am, and that that's somehow unchangeable. Any new habit or pattern can be relearned, or learned, I guess. We just have to make a conscious effort to do so. And so uh, we often, I think, with some of those absolutes, make value judgments about ourselves that then we judge ourselves and put ourselves down and think we are somehow less than because of our initial reactions to things. And that makes us feel like we can't change that because I'm innately, you know, bad or good, or some way we put some kind of qualifying um, uh, emotion to that, when it's not a judgment about who we are at all. It's just this thing that we do, and that's a changeable, modifiable thing, as long as we kind of isolate it and understand it and work toward changing it. But we often judge ourselves because of some of those things, and those absolutes. Making those absolute statements to ourselves, I think, is a way that we do kind of judge ourselves in that way. And so instead of beating ourselves up for those things, it's maybe something that we need to do. Um, it's okay to recognize it, but then use that to help you change that pattern if it's an unhealthy pattern, instead of beating yourself up for it, not changing it, and just always feeling bad about it.
Well,
That's Yeah. Go ahead.
I think it also, not absolutes with just ourselves, but it can also get in the way of our relationships with others, right? When we
Hmm.
when we get to use absolutes, or we use certain labels, right? Oh, someone is this political persuasion, or they're this religious belief, or they're this whatever it is, right? Along the spectrum. And with that label, we carry a bunch of stereotypes and beliefs about what that person thinks and how they are, and what they're like. And so it may cause us to not engage with that person, right? Or not be willing to listen to what they say, not being open to new mindsets or new ideas, because we've given them an absolute, right? Oh, well, they're just this way, and so anything that
Hmm.
this person says is going to be XYZ. And so just recognizing that it's really easy to carry absolutes around with us wherever we go, the ones that we label ourselves with and the ones that we label other people with. And labels can end up being really limiting. And so when we can take a step back and be like, hey, this is another human being in front of me. What can I learn from them? Um, and,
Right.
and obviously, like, this doesn't mean that we have to um, put ourselves in situations that are unsafe for us or that allow us to be um, trampled on by other people. But I think it is a call to be open to other mindsets, to other opinions, to other ways of thinking, and to not just silo people in labels, and be unwilling to listen to them or being unwilling to interact with them because of some of those absolutes.
Yeah, well, and I think we often, when we put those absolutes on other people, we prejudge them in ways that aren't healthy either. Um, kind of like what we do with ourselves. And I think it goes to number two of identifying with our emotions. When we have this thought of an absolute about ourselves, we often it emotes something in us, and then we identify with that emotion, and we feel like that's just part of who we are at our core instead. Um, yeah, absolutes on others. I think that's a great. Shannon dropped that in the comments, and we often do that. Uh, but I think we identify with the emotions of that with ourselves and with others. That we feel a certain way about people and feel like they're stuck being a jerk or stuck being whatever because we had that one interaction with them. And so I think we have to be careful as we have those certain emotions that we don't get stuck in kind of those absolutes of identifying with our emotions. Like I am so bad at XYZ. I am so this, that, or the other, right? We see this with children that identify as being the fat kid in elementary school. Even for the rest of their life, they identify as being the fat kid, even when sometimes it's like this just pre-puberty plump that a lot of kids do. They identify as the fat kid then, and that's a really hard cycle for them to break for the rest of their life, because they feel like that's the role that they play. And so we have to be careful with any kind of I am statements. I am so bad at whatever. Um, we've talked about this a little bit before, but when Shannon was a little girl, she was part of a craft class, and they were crafting something. I can't remember what it was. Anyway, the teacher in this craft class, how horrible is this? Told her that, yeah, you Bullard girls should just stick to the sports. And so for her whole life until she was, in her 30s almost, um, she avoided anything crafty, anything artistic, anything like any means of self expression, really, um, because she was told to just stick to the sports. That artistic expression or craftiness or things like that weren't in her wheelhouse. She was told that. And so she internalized that belief and it stuck with her for years and years. And it's so interesting how that can happen. Let's see. Christy said, I had a teacher tell me I had zero talent. And it isn't it crazy how we believe that? And it's interesting because Shannon is actually very creatively minded. It's just in like different ways than other people. So like, she still doesn't love crafty things because she feels like that's a barrier for her mentally and emotionally. But she became a very, very good photographer, and she's good at kind of seeing visual layouts and things like that. She has a lot of artistic talents, but people, you know, believe sometimes what they're told and internalize that. Yeah, and Christy says she went on to be an excellent painter. Isn't that sad that um, that we do that to other people sometimes, and sometimes unknowingly we'll make a comment that sticks with people, but that then we internalize what other people say about us, and we start to uh, identify with those things that they've told us because often because there was an emotion behind it. We felt bad about that, and then whenever we feel bad about ourselves, it brings up that thing, and we squash our potential in that area because we are bad at whatever we were told we were bad at. And so we got to be careful. So I want to know, thanks for sharing that, Christy. I want to know in the chat, what are some of the emotions that you identify with, or some of the absolutes that you believe about yourself? Are there any absolutes that have have gotten in your way of things that, oh, I'm so this or I'm so that, or every time are there those statements that you believe about yourselves? Um, so one that I tell myself all the time that I shouldn't, but I do, because I wind up believing it and letting it be my excuse is that I can't focus. I just can't focus. And so I let that be my excuse why I didn't get something done or why I was unproductive or things like that. Um, that there's that song "Blame It on My ADD," and I think I get stuck in that a lot where I do blame it on my ADD instead of just owning that uh, I could control that. I could set up my life and lifestyle in a way that that's not as big of an issue, and I need to do that better. Um, let's see. I always talk too much. I am too forgetful. Yeah, yeah. So it's interesting to hear these things that are rolling in about things and people um, that they believe about themselves. Because it's interesting, a lot of them, if you tell other people those things, they often would be like, "Really? Huh? That's surprising." Let's see. I've recently received a diagnosis that took 12 years because I didn't advocate more for myself. I think it's because I've always identified as a pleaser, whether it's parents, teachers, doctors, etc. Yeah, being that like um, oh, you're just my easy child, right? Telling your parent that, or as a parent telling your child that, can sometimes be a dangerous thing. Oh, you're just my sweet child. You're just my easy kid. Because then you create a pleaser out of that child that doesn't stick up for themselves, and you kind of set them up to be trampled upon. And so you got to be careful with some of those things. I don't know if that's true, Lori, if those things were said about you of like, oh, you're my easy kid, or you're just my sweet kid, you're always so easy. But I've seen that happen to other people, and including myself and Shannon. We're actually both were kind of our parents like, oh, you're just my easy kid. And so then you try to be the easy kid instead of kind of stick up for yourself. um, yeah, and so we have to be careful with some of those things that we tell our kids, even though that we're intending that to be sweet and like, oh, that meant so much to me that you weren't as difficult as some of your siblings. Like we mean that in a good way, but sometimes it can create in that child the desire to continue to please instead of stick up for themselves, and it pours over into other relationships.
So it's really interesting. I teach at church a younger kids class, and we had kind of a intro game just to get to know the new kids coming into the class with the new year. And one of the questions was, "What do you love about yourself?" Or what's something that you love about yourself? Which
Mm,
was a really interesting question. And what was even more interesting is how people answered it. And there were a couple. So two I remember. One said, "I love that I'm confident," and another said, "I love that I don't let people walk all over me," or something like that. But most of the kids couldn't come up with something, right? Or it wasn't really something about them. It was like, I love that I'm in a family that I can have fun with, which is great. Like I'm glad for them, but they couldn't identify something that they loved about themselves.
mm,
And so I think that's a good question to ask ourselves. And this is not something you have to answer in the chat, but just ask yourselves, what's something that I love about myself? And if that's something that you're struggling to do, right, to identify even one characteristic, then maybe that's a question to spend some time with. What is good about me? Let's see what Nathan said. I
yeah.
struggled with algebra and had a high school teacher tell me not to bother with college and just get a job after high school. The
Mm-mm.
intention was to be motivating, but in a negative way. It didn't motivate me. It shut me down. I eventually did do college and graduated, but a terrible teacher. That's crazy. And so I think
Oh, isn't
it's
that so sad?
Oh, it's terrible. And the sad thing is that like there's probably things that I've said to people, right, that they've taken that way. And so I think this is um being careful with what we say to people, because I think it's so easy to think that our influence is small, right? Like, oh, I'm not a role model, or I don't have that much of an effect on other people, or what are the other things that we may tell ourselves. And yes, like most of us are a lot more worried about our other problems and probably don't pay attention to the other things that people do. But I think we pay to people that are in positions of authority or people that we respect or trust. We tend to put more weight onto what they say. And so recognizing that, being careful of how we act in the significant relationships in our lives, if we're in positions of authority or we're around close friends and family, being really careful about how we say things and and what we're saying, right? Not just the content of our language, but also the context of our language and how we're doing those things, because it can have an impact years later, right? And I can think of teachers that had a really positive impact and ones that had not so positive impacts. And it's unfortunate, right? Because um, I think as kids, right, we hear a criticism and it's much easier to internalize that thing, right? I must be the problem. I must be the wrong one. And so then we carry that way, right? I am this way, or you know, oh, go ahead, Cameron.
Well, so we missed a couple up above that I think speak to your point. So as the comments were coming in, we missed a couple, and they're both kind of similar. So Christine and Leslie said both, I'm addicted to sugar and I can't wait to eat, and I'm an emotional eater. So it's, sometimes those things that we believe about ourselves really do get stuck in there. And sometimes those things will come from other people. Oh, you're just addicted to sugar, or oh, that's my little sweet tooth there. I mean, so many of those things are kid things that our parents say to us, right? Oh, they love their candy or whatever. And so then we identify as that, that I'm addicted to sugar. um, those types of things, we believe those things about ourselves, and then it really gets stuck in there. And so we have to be so careful with that. Like Mark was saying, when we not even always in a position of influence, it can just be like to friends and relatives, people that care about us, and so they care about what we say. um, and so that's we have to be careful with some of those things. I know that the I'm an emotional eater, um, or that um, I'm just a big eater, or things like that. For me, that was always a thing, that I was a big eater. Like that, my dad told me that all the time growing up. Oh, you must have a hollow leg, and where do you put all that food and things like that, which I saw as this badge of honor because I was always the little guy. And so being the little guy that could out eat everybody was, the cool thing or something. For some reason, I don't know why that is a good thing, but it, you know, was, I guess, in our family. And so now I feel like I have to destroy the fridge every time I eat because I'm a big eater. I'm a good boy that cleans my plate and all those things. So we just have to be really careful, um, what we believe about ourselves and what we say to other people, because we say some of those things with good intentions often. We have some examples of some really awful things of teachers and things saying just some horrible things, um, that are so limiting to somebody if they believe that. But I think we also sometimes will say things where we think we're giving a compliment, or we think we're being positive, and we are, I guess, in our heart of hearts we are, but it can sometimes stick with people. We tend to twist those things that people say to us or about us, right? And maybe believe them too much to where it can be harmful. So and maybe some of that is us maybe over internalizing things that people say to us, but we just have to be careful what we say, and be cognizant of how our words can affect others. um anyway, so many great comments though. I love it. Good stuff today. So one of the things so the last point is that perfect is the enemy of good. And I think that is one of the big problems, is I think we're all striving to be perfect in a lot of ways, that we don't want to let down other people. But the problem is that standard of perfect is pretty impossible to do. And so sometimes we try so hard to hold ourselves to perfect that we're not okay with the fact that we're good at something. um, And like art is a great example. May not be perfect at it. My nose on my painting may not have been perfect, but it's still pretty good. And we sometimes beat ourselves up for not being perfect, and we allow it to frustrate the good that we do or can be or whatever. Um, Christy says it's so helpful to remember to say things like today or right now when praising or critiquing. Yeah, yeah. To not say it's an always thing, but like, oh, that effort today was good, and or that that thing. Oh, this wasn't your best day. I've seen you do better, or something like that. When making a criticism, to show that it's not them or they always do something, but this time maybe wasn't their best effort. I think that's really important, Christy, to make sure we add those qualifiers in to maybe inspire them to do better, or to really point out a good day that they had instead of um, making an absolute statement. I think that's one of the things. Those absolutes can work both ways. When people make absolute statements about others, that's where they become dangerous. I know.
Oh,
Any final thoughts,
unmuted.
Mark?
Yeah, so two final thoughts. One is it goes back to the idea of ideal, of what are the points that we're looking at back on, right? Am I comparing myself to my ideal, or am I comparing myself to the progress that I've made
Mm,
as I'm striving towards that
I
ideal?
love
And
that.
when we compare where we are now to our ideal, we fall short every time. And so we feel like I must not be making any progress. Nothing must be changing.
Yeah.
But when we look back and compare, like, well, how did I used to think, or how did I used to act, or what have I learned since this point? Then we can see a huge amount of progress, a huge amount of change. When I realistically look back on, you know 15-year-old me, 25-year-old me, 29-year-old me, like, they're very different people. And while I've been me all along, the me I am now is actually much different than I was before, right? The way that I approach problems, and for sure, I'm sure there's characteristics that have followed through, but there's also a lot that's changed, right? And so recognizing that, right, looking back on our progress. And two, sometimes it can be difficult to see that change in ourselves. And so finding someone that you trust, that has a pattern of of thinking well, and what I mean by that, or has a pattern of being more accurate in their judgments. And what I mean by that is, it could be easy to ask a parent, like, oh, well, what are some good qualities about me, and here's some of those things back. Oh, well, you're my little angel, you always do this, and you're the peacemaker, and or whatever it might be. um Someone that can see our flaws but can also see the good about us, and maybe give a more accurate viewpoint, and ask them, right, like, what are some of my good characteristics, and have an outside perspective on, hey, these are things that you objectively do well. I found that both of those can be helpful in kind of pushing aside some of those absolutes and getting a different take on, well, how do I actually show up in the world, right? What am I doing well?
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. I don't know. Some of the things you said there were really really powerful. Yeah, I just think, with all of these mindsets, we have to be careful what we say to others, but we also have to be careful in what we believe, about ourselves and things like that. That any criticism, any thought is maybe true in the moment, but isn't true globally about us. And so we've got to be careful thinking in those absolutes and believing those I am statements, or those those absolute statements, those every time, every whatever. We have to be so careful in believing those things about ourselves and being okay with being good. I always say done is better than perfect. Perfect is that enemy of good. That if we're holding ourselves to an unrealistic standard, then it's going to keep us from being and delivering a lot of good to the world. And so be okay with good. Be okay with I'm doing my best is okay, and that's good enough. And as long as you truly are striving for that and trying to identify those things in your personality that are, mindsets and habits that are holding you back and you're working on those things, then you're doing great. The fact that you're in this, group right now listening to this call means that you're trying to work on certain aspects of yourself. So you're in the right spot doing the right things and improving yourself. So give yourself kudos for that you aren't fixed and that you are able to change and mold yourself into more of who you'd like to become, and know that that's a pattern and a stepwise process, that you're embarking on that journey to do those things. And so you're headed in the right direction, and you can give yourself some grace for that. So anyway, thanks so much for joining us on the call today, and hopefully that's a step in the right direction of dropping perfect and going for the good. Yeah, thanks again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you on the call tomorrow. We'll see you then. Thanks, Christine.
Thanks for listening to the Becoming Body Smart podcast. If you have questions, thoughts, or want to continue the conversation, reach out to us on our socials or join our community. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and leave a review. It helps us bring you even more valuable content. Remember, sustainable health is a lifelong journey, and we're here to support you every step of the way. Live longer, live stronger, and become body smart.